I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. On last week's episode, I had a wonderful and wide-ranging conversation with Michael McCoy, the longtime co-director of Cranbrook's design program. Longtime listeners of the show know I've had a long fascination with that institution and specifically with that design program. I've had many former students on the show and even wrote an essay about it for AIGA's Eye on Design 2 years ago. During the McCoy's tenure, Michael focused largely on the industrial design side of the department, and his wife Katherine led what we now think of as the pioneering graphic design program. So, continuing from last week's conversation, I am excited to share this conversation with Kathy that looks at the development of the graphic design curriculum within Cranbrook's design department. Katherine McCoy originally studied interior design and industrial design before getting a job at Unimark, the famed design studio led by Massimo Vignelli, right out of school. At 25, she and Mike took over as the co-artists in residences at the design department at Cranbrook, and it was under her leadership that graphic design truly became an area of study in the design program and became a leader in developing design theory, postmodernism, deconstruction, and formal invention. In this conversation, we talk about all of that. I was really curious to hear how Kathy learned to teach in a program that famously had no classes and no grades, especially when in those early years, she was often the same age as her students. We talk about the state of graphic design and how she thought about creating a community that was comfortable with challenging the status quo. And we talk about the influence that that program had beyond the walls of Cranbrook. If you are at all interested in graphic design history, in graphic design pedagogy, in graphic design theory, this conversation looks at how our modern understanding of these fields really began. I am so honored to have had the chance to speak to both Mike and Kathy and learn more about this truly pivotal moment in design history. This show is funded by Patreon supporters. So if you like what we're doing here on Scratching the Surface, I hope you consider supporting us on Patreon for just a few bucks a month. Members get full transcripts of every episode. We do bonus interviews and other exclusive content each month. We're about to launch some exciting new projects, and the Patreon supporters are the first people to see these and to give feedback on those. So you can visit us at patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the information and to sign up. We really, truly couldn't do it without you. Thank you so much for listening, and here is my really wonderful conversation with the great Katherine McCoy. As I was thinking about talking to you, I returned to the book that you and Mike published on your time at Cranbrook Design, the New Discourse. And I want to begin by reading two quotes from that book in the essay that you both wrote and sort of ask, I'm curious how you sort of think about these ideas today. And so you write, much of the work done at Cranbrook has been dedicated to changing the status quo. It is polemical, calculated to ruffle designers' feathers, and it has done that. And then a little bit later you write, the profession of design in the 1970s had fallen into a state of stasis that was suffocating. The new generation of students, some of them now working in their own successful studios, has challenged the sterility of universal design and is emerging with highly personal interpretations. And I loved both of those because I think that really speaks to the myth and the legend and the narrative around the Cranbrook Design Department, and especially the Cranbrook Design Department as you and Mike led it. But what struck me reading that today is when I think about the profession of design in the 1970s has fallen to a state of stasis that was suffocating, I almost wonder if we're in a state like that today, especially in graphic design. And it's not modernist anymore. It's not the sort of universal design, but it is design thinking. It is user experience. All of these things are creating a certain sort of stasis, a certain sameness. Um, do you feel that also from your position with this sort of history? What's your sort of view on the state of graphic design today and where that sort of challenging of the status quo is happening?
I have to say, I'm really not sure what the state of graphic design practice is today. It seems very dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, technology is just moving so fast and creating a lot of um, opportunities for change, and people are doing a lot of experimentation, but at the same time, there seems to be maybe a lack of focus. It's but but we need to remember that the design fields go through cycles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not quite sure where we are in the cycle right now. But to go back to the idea of the 1970s, design had made some progress at that point, and I see, especially in graphic design, um, it kind of came out of a very unformed state. In a way, it was the last of the design fields to professionalize,
Yeah.
define itself, and discover its history and methodologies. And so modernism arrived, Swiss graphic design in particular, in the late 60s and early 70s. So then, it got absorbed into the mainstream practice pretty fast. So by the middle 70s, became very corporate.
Right.
Corporations discovered that modernism in graphic design worked really well for
Right.
corporate communication. And it's whereas in the late sort of mid to late 60s at Unimark, we had to fight to use sans serifs, Universe and
Right.
Helvetica,
Right.
where by the mid 70s, you had to fight not to use those.
Right.
Maybe, modernism, the graphic language of modernism became the sort of official corporate style. So that quote was that statement in the essay was sort of about that
Yeah.
dynamic. And then we went through a cycle of shaking things up, and then pretty soon we saw firms asking for employees that were, competent in that Cranbrook
Right.
graphic design.
Right. Okay, we'll get to that. I want to come back to that, but let's stay in the sort of 60s and 70s for a second. I asked this question to Mike also, and I'm curious about sort of your own design education as somebody who had such a big influence on design, and especially in the context of the 70s, like we were just talking about, and what you were just saying about sort of graphic design's sort of late maturation as a design field, because you were a student right in there, and you began studying interior design and then switched to industrial design and then went on to teach primarily graphic design. Tell me about that early education. How did that shape a lot of the work you would go on to do?
Well, as a high school student, gravitating towards design, I kind of became aware that I was not an artist, taking
Mhm.
art in high school, and that actually, if my high school art teacher had just said, "You're not an artist, you're a designer. Look into design," and pointed me in some direction, that would have saved a lot of time.
Yeah.
Uh, but I was really drawn, actually, from middle school on, to architecture. But all I knew of architecture were the home magazines, House Beautiful
uh,
and House and Garden. And I started drawing floor plans in middle
mm.
and junior high on my notebook pages during class. And
We were the same middle school students 50 years apart. I was doing the exact same thing.
Interesting. And so, I told the high school counselor that I wanted to be an architect. And you may have read this. I've told people, I've complained about this before.
Yes.
And this
Yes.
herringbone jacket guy, that's all I remember of him, told me the girls weren't architects and I should be an interior decorator. And I'm like, oh, okay. But he had no advice of what schools to go to. He certainly didn't say, you should go to Art Center or Pratt, which were the two leading schools at that point. And I just trotted off to the, you know, nearby state university because they listed interior design in the catalog. And it never occurred to me that one school would be better than another. Um, And when I got there, it turned out that interior design actually was only offered as special problems in the art department. The real interior design major was in home ec, and that
Mm,
was, decorating basically,
right.
so you could sell furniture in department stores when you graduated. Um, so industrial design was, sort of the option, the alternative there, and as well as graphic design. But I really didn't, I mean, I hadn't even heard the term graphic design then. And actually, in 1963, when I landed in college, I, that term wasn't used very
Right.
much.
Right.
Yale, at Yale, that was probably the only program using that term at that point. Maybe Kansas City Art Institute,
Mm-hmm.
a few schools. And so, well, okay, I'll go into industrial design. And actually, I'm glad I did, because I think I got a slightly more conceptual uh, framework and foundation in industrial design than I would have in any graphic design program in the country at that point.
Mm,
Because, George Nelson problem solving, and there
mm-hmm.
was Henry Dreyfus human factors and rudimentary ergonomics at that point. And so I think I got a little more conceptual foundation in industrial design, but I'm not a very three-dimensional talent. Pretty two-dimensional, and I got to, I was allowed by the one good professor we had to do some interior design projects, but he really wasn't prepared to, teach or critique interior design. Um, so, it was more of a conceptual foundation than a formal one. But I also took one course in graphic design in the art department, and that was
Okay.
so lame. I didn't take any more.
Why?
But
Why was it lame? What did you do in that class?
oh, it was Jackson Pollock's brother who was teaching it, and
Okay.
it was 10 weeks of chancery italic calligraphy.
Ah,
Um,
yeah.
and uh, state university programs were in design, as you are probably well aware, were very
Mm-hmm.
unformed
Mm-hmm.
through the 50s, 60s. It's only really in more recent years, especially with the NASAD accreditation
Yep.
standards developed with AIGA, that we have really begun to define what a graphic design foundational education would
Yeah.
be.
Yeah.
Um, so it just didn't seem worth spending any more time in that program. But meanwhile, as I went through industrial design, I fell in love with typography and
Mm.
corporate trademarks, and
Mm.
and
Mm-hmm.
I found a couple of books in the bookstore, just little Studio Vista British books on graphic design, and I really then became kind of convinced that that was my true love. Although I've always been interested in the idea of cross-disciplinary design, and exhibitions, interiors,
Yeah.
products. It all seems related.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems, and that's sort of why I asked that, because it seems like that interest was there from the beginning, and the fact that you sort of you had this interest in architecture, you sort of found yourself in interior design slash decorating, industrial design, while interested in typography. That sort of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary seems like that was there from the beginning. Was Unimark your first job after you graduated?
Yeah, I think I'd read about it in Industrial Design magazine, my last
Yeah.
semester in school, and then, graduated. Mike and I got married. We're living in the suburbs of Detroit, and I'm looking for my first job with a pretty um, unformed portfolio from this rather rudimentary program. And my friend that was working at a good design firm in Detroit had gone to Pratt, and I was like, oh, I guess I made a mistake in my choice of schools, except I met Mike.
Yeah, that
And
makes it all worth it.
really, so I'm looking through the yellow pages for design firms to call up to interview with. And lo and behold, there's Unimark.
Mm-hmm.
There's an office nearby that had just been opened. And I was like, oh, I've read about this. I called them up and zoomed down there for an interview. And it was perfect timing. We've benefited from fortuitous timing several times
I,
in our
I'm
career.
getting that.
Something,
Yeah.
yeah, just good fortune. And the design director of this small office of Unimark, and they had offices. The main one was Chicago, and New York with Massimo Vignelli, but they had a
Mm-hmm.
number of others, and they were opening offices around. Um, the design director of ours had taught at University of Illinois, and thought maybe if he hired a junior designer, he could kind of continue doing some teaching.
Uh,
And so I, interviewed just as he was looking for a junior designer. And it turned out he was way too busy to ever, do any of that. But I worked with some really great people at Unimark. It was a really close knit group of, some really exceptional designers.
did you have the ability to be multidisciplinary there? I mean, it seems like Unimark is like the perfect. I mean, you even said you benefited from sort of fortuitous timing. That seems like the perfect job for somebody who's interested in all these different facets of design. Were you able to actually do that, or sort of how did the
Yeah.
structure, like, was it structured sort of discipline based, or can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, the two designers I worked the most closely with were interior and
Mm,
exhibition designers and signage.
okay.
And we did a lot of signage at Unimark, and they also did some major corporate identity offices. Our Detroit office was opened on a massive contract with Ford Motor Company to do
Uh,
their corporate identity program. And fortunately, the main designers were so busy doing the big Ford project that these other interesting projects that came along kind of fell to me in some cases. And I worked with these two designers that were more 3D and interdisciplinary. And one of the projects, the most interesting one we worked on, was a project for Frontier Airlines to design a ticket counter system for them,
mm,
that was modular and could be. They had um, ticket counters in lots of regional Western airports. This is a different Frontier Airlines, same name but different company,
right.
and so this idea of a modular system that you could just send out on the planes and put up on these knotty pine paneling and
Hmm.
Durango, Colorado's airport, and we did do a prototype there. We worked on projects like that together also, and so again, they were so busy doing the core of the project. Part of the concept of the system was it was based on a 4-foot module, 4-foot square module, um, to show how we could do promotional posters that would be changed periodically.
Uh,
And so they fell to me. And
hmm.
because it was like the least, sort of revenue generating element of the project.
Right.
And it was actually my first printed pieces
Oh
were
wow.
posters for these ticket counter prototypes. And this is kind of a fun thing. I got my first crit on those posters by Massimo Vignelli, who was the head of all graphic design for the Unimark offices, and he would regularly critique
Right.
um, work done in all the offices. And it was relayed to me by our design director that Massimo's critique was they were too contrived. We're setting the theme for our many years relationship.
Yeah, we'll come back to that because I have other questions about that relationship.
but, but it was, very exciting. Unimark was a very exciting place to be. And and these designers had great expertise, so I was just
Mhm.
a sponge. It was like going to graduate school, and I, hovered over their work.
Yeah.
And two actual Swiss designers, Harry Bowler and Peter Teubner, spent several weeks in our office. They were loaned to us from the Chicago office to work on the Ford corporate identity manuals. And, I really learned the grid system from those guys. And
Right.
it was, they were very generous. And our office had a bookshelf of the Swiss Bibles, which were
Uh,
not available in bookstores at that point. Mueller Brockman, Emil Ruder,
right.
Hermann Hoffman, Karl Gerstner. And I copied every page of those books after hours on the photocopier. And I still have those in binders.
I love that. So, okay, so tell me how you go from that. And I love that you said that that was like a graduate school experience, because as you were talking about, I was thinking the same thing. Like, this feels like a sort of professional graduate school. But tell me why at age 25 you think I'm going to start teaching. What was interesting to you about taking that Cranbrook position? So young in your career.
Well, first of all, I was pretty sure that I didn't ever want to teach. Um,
Okay.
I was a crafts counselor in summer camp during college. And, I really was, I concluded at the end of that, it's like, I don't want to teach this stuff. I want to do it.
Yeah.
And I want to make it myself. And, I had a very narrow idea of what teaching could be, clearly from that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this job at Cranbrook, the position really literally fell into our laps. It was nothing we sought. And we had not ever discussed being teachers at that point. And hence our, initial reaction, like, oh, that's kind of odd. We just kind of laughed it off for the first few hours until we started talking about it later that evening. One thing though, it occurs to me, we were at the Aspen conference, and that's 1971. And as I
Mm-hmm.
recall, that was the conference that was chaired by Richard Farson, the new president of CalArts. And CalArts was brand
Ah,
new, the first
right.
president of CalArts. And he presented this idea of an alternative approach to design education. And they had just had their first year of classes, and they had recruited really high level faculty. Um, and we were kind of, we were inspired by this idea that CalArts was sort of projecting of what design education could be. And the ironic thing is that fell apart after a couple of years. Um, and but in a way, the kind of fallout of that was that we had embraced a lot of those ideas when we got to Cranbrook.
I mean, what were some of those ideas, or like why was that sort of presentation so transformational for you?
Well, I'm trying to think exactly what it was. It was slightly interdisciplinary, but not. Yeah, it was basically interdisciplinary. It was very counterculture. It was
Mm-hmm.
um, about embracing the idea of community, I think, and our users, our audiences,
Uh,
um, was very idealistic. Um, Sheila DeBrethville was the
right.
I think the main graphic design person there. At that point, Peter DeBrethville in architecture, Victor Papanek for industrial
Mm-hmm.
design, which all of those people lasted a very short time there. I don't really know what happened to so that vision didn't go forward, but yeah, it was kind of a power to the people approach in design,
Yeah.
which led to our interest in um, uh, uh, communicating the benefits of good design to the public and how to embrace and bring better design into their lives.
can you talk about sort of like graphic design culture and study at Cranbrook when you got there? Then I talked to Mike a little bit about this, and I've previously talked to Andrew Blauvelt about this. The design program historically was very focused on industrial design with the influence of the Eames, and there's very little documentation about kind of graphic design. I'm putting graphic design in quotes right now, work before you got there. I think of Stephen Fickram.
Right.
Stephen? Yeah, Stephen Fickram is sort of like the canonical pre-McCoy's Cranbrook graphic designer. Um, what was sort of, how was graphic design seen, or how did that sort of fit into the design program when you got there, or did it at all?
It was very much a afterthought. And really, we had, as far to my knowledge, there are only two graduates pre 1971 in graphic design that then went into the field, and that's Steve Frickholm, and then his good buddy colleague when he was at Cranbrook, John Barry, who
Oh yeah.
then was spent the first part of his career in architectural signage, a really large architecture firm in Detroit, and then moved to Herman Miller. Um, and so those were, it was just because two students showed up wanting to go into graphic design, why they, added that element to the department. Before we came, the department had kind of devolved into two part-time teachers that were, their salaries were paid by General Motors. That lasted that was maybe a
Okay.
four-year period. And the 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 main teacher, who was supposed to be there maybe 3 days a week, was the head of education and recruiting at General Motors Tech Center for products for cars.
Mm.
And we actually found a contract or a letter of agreement in the files that he left behind that stated what some percentage of projects, student projects in the design department were supposed to have four wheels on them,
Oh wow.
and that GM was looking to Cranbrook as an alternative source of new designers to Art Center. I mean, it explicitly stated that.
Wow.
So they were largely funding the department in those
That's
years.
interesting.
And the head of architectural signage and corporate identity at the Tech Center, Homer Mitchell, I believe was his name, um, spent one evening a week in the design department. So that was the teaching that Steve Frickholm and John Barry got in grad school.
And then, so was it important for you to sort of build out this graphic design side of the design program? I mean, I think the narrative is, and I'm maybe asking you to correct this or elaborate on it, is that you and Mike together ran to the department, and he sort of focused on industrial design, you focused on graphic design, but there was a lot of conversation and sort of moving between both sides of those. How did you sort of develop a graphic design was part of this program, or how did you kind of think about that?
Well, I think the vice president that asked us to interview and made the decision to offer us the position, her vision of the department was that it should be truly interdisciplinary, and it
Mm,
should include graphic design and product design and other areas, exhibitions and
right.
interiors too, if possible. So it had something. I think we got some mandate from her. But, of course, Mike's and my interests were very much, split between graphic design or communications design and three-dimensional design. Um, so it was kind of a natural thing to
Hmm.
build a graphic design program. And in fact, because we were hired during the summer, that first incoming group of new students had already been admitted,
Right.
and
Oh,
at least half of them were, were coming for graphic design. So it was a natural
okay.
thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And I can say that a lot of the interdisciplinary nature of the communications between students, the sharing of resources, readings,
Hmm.
theories, um, had to do with proximity. We mixed them up in the studio. You know,
Uh,
so you had an industrial designer sitting next adjacent to a graphic designer and looking at each other's books and watching
mhm.
each other's work. So a lot of the actual cross fertilization happened just through proximity.
I have a perhaps weird question. I'm really interested. This the fact that you're in your mid-20s. You did not want to teach. You thought you didn't want to teach. Um, you are now co-running a department in a school that famously has no classes and no grades and no
Right,
assignments.
right.
Um, Tell me about those first couple of years. Like, how did you figure out what to do, or like what your role was in
Yeah,
that system when you're still even like figuring out what graphic design is in some ways? How'd
for
you Can you
sure,
talk about that a little bit?
for sure. First of all, I want. There's a point I'd like to make about the fact that we had gone to a fairly rudimentary design program. We had one really good faculty person. There
Mm,
was hardly a curriculum. It was just, you took a studio course every semester.
mhm.
Um, and as a result, we had to invent teaching for ourselves. And I've observed through the years that a lot of teachers, a lot of faculty that had really solid and rigorous undergraduate educations in design tend to teach as they were taught. And it's sometimes they actually just use the same projects that they
Yeah.
had students. And so I think, in a way, although it would seem as a liability that our undergraduate experience wasn't so hot, actually it was a catalyst to inventing teaching for ourselves. And so, yeah, so when we began, our experience with design was mostly professional practice.
Mhm.
And so the first year or two, maybe we were just teaching in a very pragmatic way. And for me, of course, it was based on my conviction of modernist graphic
Right.
design,
Right.
Swiss modernism, and a functionalist ethic. But after a year or so, between the students and my work too, we kind of had that down.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
with, that we explored the grid system and we're very good at it, and we had a good rational, logical functionalist approach. But being in an art school, there's this um, mandate for exploration, innovation,
Mhm.
moving forward. So, it was kind of in the atmosphere for one thing, but just personally too. It's like, well, what more is there? There must be more. Where can
Yeah.
we go from here? And so, in the projects and I assigned more projects in graphic design, especially early on, than Mike
Okay.
did. And, the project cycle in 3D is longer. And it's just more complex, to design a chair or, a product than it is to design a poster. And
Mhm.
so in those first years, sort of invented a whole range of projects that kind of, became the core of my teaching. And each one was sort of focused on maybe developing a little different area of expertise in
Mm.
both form and method. Um, and one of the things I love about teaching, and Mike already mentioned this, the teacher learns the
Right.
most, for
Right.
sure.
Right.
And another thing I love is the opportunity for iteration. So I would, assign a new project one year, and then the next year it's like, well, okay, I got that. I got the results last year from that laboratory experiment in that project, and here are some opportunities to take it in a little different direction, or push it a little further,
Yeah.
and or add another layer of challenge to it. And so I love that about teaching.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
you
me
can,
too. I mean, that's why I teach too. I completely get that. Um, can you tell me more about this sort of like after a couple of years feeling like, well, we know how to do this, and this sort of impulse to kind of push things forward, and with the fact that there being no classes, how can you talk about sort of like how much you were sort of pushing things forward, and both like in work you were doing sort of professionally and sort of like outside of like teaching, and then students' interests, like how did those start to kind of develop the interest in semiotics, the interest in meaning? How did how were sort of the groups organized so those ideas could start to bubble up?
yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. Well, first of all, at Cranbrook, they do call us artists, designers, architects, and residents. And
Right.
the idea that we're supposed to be pursuing our own work at least about half time, teaching half time, and given a studio adjacent to the students' studios, so that we were working ourselves, in our own design. And right away at Cranbrook, actually, it's in our first contract. We were supposed to design the next school academic catalog as
Okay.
part of our first year's work and the salary, which, by the way, was our contract was for $11,000.
Wow. For
Of course,
both of you combined.
we got, yeah, for two people.
Wow.
um we and then this sort of fiction that we were each half time, because of course it's a very
Oh, wow.
enveloping experience, so we were each working at full tilt.
Right.
um but I immediately started, with that catalog, and then design materials for the museum, especially
Mhm.
the art museum, posters, catalogs, invitations, etc. I was very active in my own graphic design. So, and the students were watching my work. I was watching their work. It's just this kind of um, soup of influence between this all of us.
The reason I asked that question is because this sort of that quote that we opened with about the Cranbrook was designed to challenge the status quo and was meant to be polemical. It seems like that sort of thing can only happen in a program like Cranbrook, where there is this sort of self-generation of work, where it isn't just assignment, 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 and class, 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 and grade, grade, grade. um and I'm wondering if you sort of knew that that was happening as it was happening, that these new ideas were being brought in that weren't being talked about everywhere else, that this was sort of challenging what we thought of. What was it like in that moment? Were you aware that this was a provocation of some sort?
Well, we've always, I think, from the beginning, felt that um, the sort of central goal for each student was to find their own voice
Hmm.
in design. But also, I've always, probably going back to my Unimark time, been very convinced that design needed to move forward, needed to mature. That all the design fields are very young, and especially graphic design, and needed to professionalize,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
become, more mature, more fully developed. Um, and also at Cranbrook, our original, we our student body was who applied. One of
Right.
the challenges at Cranbrook was to communicate what the department is about and attract a better level of student.
Right.
The first students that were there, they just came in over the transom. I don't even know how they found out about Cranbrook. And so doing posters and publishing about the design program was really an important thing, especially in the
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
years. Um, so that we then gradually began to get a higher level of applicants. And I think, let's see, Meredith must have arrived after 3 or 4 years into our
She was
time,
early, I think. Yeah.
and very early, and also Patrick Whitney.
Yep.
And they were there together, and that was about the point where we began to get the kind of student we wanted, that
Right.
we
Right.
felt, was going to be able to respond to what we were envisioning for the program. And as Mike mentioned, that the whole focus on public information about design, problem solving in the man-made environment being one of the first examples and the biggest first one. Um, that idea of public information became a real important focus for us, and in a way that fit with the modernist period still, because it was information design.
Right, right. I mean, what I'm curious about, I guess, or what you said in there that was really interesting to me is this desire to advance the profession, advance graphic design professionally, to professionalize, and then there's also interest in students sort of developing their own voices, their own critical practices. And I think at a surface level, it would be very easy to see those two things as in conflict with each other. Um, and this goes back to sort of that sort of thing you said earlier about being inside of an art school, and this sort of idea of responding to prompts versus, and Mike and I talked about this too, responding to prompts versus sort of self generation. How do you see those as in service of each other, as sort of developing voice and point of view and individuality and professionalizing at large?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there was, uh, I guess maybe that kind of touches on the sort of emerging little, not exactly a conflict, but a divergence away from modernism,
Hmm.
which, was supposed to, your forms were supposed to be functional, minimal, neutral, universal, where, and particularly being in an art school, and then also, working closely with Danielle Leveskin, this
Hmm.
idea of critical design, your personal voice, your own vision. That was seen to be in conflict with a modernist,
Yeah,
view
right.
of design. But and in a way, that's sort of where Massimo Vignoli was. Someone told us said at a conference that Cranbrook was the most dangerous design school in America.
I was gonna bring that up. That was the next thing I was gonna say.
And so, a good modernist sort of felt like we were ruining design.
Yeah.
But to me, it's an enrichment of design. It's a skilled designer, a mature designer knows how to balance,
Mhm.
functionalism and solving real problems with, at the same time, their own critical vision, their own maybe eccentric vision.
Yeah.
It's an enrichment. It's not a conflict.
Maybe working with graduate students, it was a little bit different, but did you have thoughts on sort of students developing these sort of like, you know, personal voices, critical practices with the balance of also thinking about what would happen after and jobs and, saying, sort of the disciplinary definitions of this. And the reason I ask you that is as you were saying that, I was thinking about, I interviewed Elliot Earls, your like kind of second successor, I guess,
Mhm.
and former student. And he told me this really beautiful story about how he was doing these like performance pieces and the students were not really getting it. And that you sat with him and said, like, if this is what you want to do, like, do it like this. Like, this counts too. How did you sort of like think about that? This, I don't mean to single out that example specifically, but that kind of thing, which does not seem like something that would be seen in a graphic design portfolio, encouraging that while also thinking about defining graphic design.
Well, first of all, I have to say, we're at the beginning. I started out teaching thinking I knew what design was, right? It's, that Unimark vision of modernism. Um, Form follows function, minimalist form, etc. And I went from there to becoming more and more permissive,
Mm, mhm.
laissez-faire. Um, but that's I'm just kind of overstating the case there. But I've through the years, it's I kind of learned to be more, I think, open, and
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
students, sometimes very kind of accidental impulses even, but, to new possibilities. And I've become more of a coach than a
Mm,
teacher,
mhm, mhm.
especially because we were getting more and more mature and more talented students as the years went by. It seemed like it took less and less, kind of fewer rules, and
Right.
to, we wanted to catalyze their work rather than direct it. But one thing I would like to mention is that, from the beginning, I had, a conviction that there were not enough books in design. We didn't have enough written about design. And at the first year, I started the bibliography,
Ah, right.
department bibliography. And I've always loved reading and books anyway. We had a wonderful librarian at that point, who was very concerned that no one had ordered any books in design for years. But
Mm,
but the library had an incredible collection from the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
right.
Um, so she was willing to order anything I wanted, and the school actually paid for me to go to New York and go to used bookstores, in Manhattan, and I bought up all the books that hadn't been bought in the previous
Right.
10 or 15 years. Um, and and every year I updated the bibliography, and first that was in the package of materials we gave to the students every
Got it.
fall, first thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I initiated the reading project, to sort of, at first, just to get them reading, but then after that it became just part of the program. Um, I asked each student to every semester to, at the end of the semester, to write a paper, sort of a book review of 3 books
Mm,
that they
mm,
had read during the semester. Pick the 3 that were most influential or maybe related to each other, and write something about this. Um, and we made that available to everybody. We copied them
right.
and
Right.
throughout the department. And then also, as part of that end of the semester review, to bring 3 um, note cards with, each one a vocabulary term, that
Ah,
they had encountered during the semester. Either a new word or a new definition of a term, that was kind of indicative of some of the ideas that they were encountering that
interesting.
semester. And then I compiled that into this ongoing vocabulary list. And that started from, a young woman, Japanese student we had. Um, she was an interior design student. Um,
Mm.
she started in the fall keeping her own vocabulary list, because even though she spoke pretty good,
Oh,
textbook English, she was finding that there are all these
right.
specialized
Right.
uses of words that had design meanings that were different than what you found in the dictionary.
Oh, that's a
And
great idea.
yeah, and it occurred to me, well, of course, the way we use words is very indicative of what we're thinking. So that was, at first, I felt like we needed to catalyze reading and writing.
Yeah.
But then there was a turning point, very much so. And that was, in the early to mid 80s.
This
Jeff
was my
Kennedy
next
was part
question.
of
Yeah.
that. Where at the in the late 70s, we got very good at form at Cranbrook, and it was labeled postmodernist, new wave, whatever, and then a couple of classes of students, graphic design students, got really kind of itchy or antsy to find theory.
Right.
What explains all this? And at first, it was kind of random, and we had been reading design history for a while by this point. That was another
Mhm.
thing in the mid 70s. Maybe that's where students really started reading, was reading design
Oh,
history.
interesting. Yeah.
But then this like search for theory began, and I think it was really there were some interesting you know things that came up. I've been encouraging and people to look at semiotics for a while,
Right.
but then in I think it was really Jeff Keaty's class where they really discovered literary criticism
Yeah.
and deconstruction um, and post structuralism as really a fertile area for exploration for understanding communications,
Mhm.
and then that just took off.
How did that change the program? Because I think, like, in many ways, that is the legacy of your tenure there. Is this sort of encouraging, this introduction, and this fostering of theory, semiotics, literary criticism, structuralism, etc., and that didn't just blow up at Cranbrook, but that blew up in a lot of places. Emigre was doing stuff with it. I
Mhm.
studied under Ellen Lupton, and she and Abbott were kind of, interested in these ideas.
Yes.
How did that sort of change what you were doing in the program? Did people start coming to the program because of these ideas? Can you just talk a little bit about sort of the aftermath of that?
Well, I have a feeling that we were fortunate enough to have Andrew Blaufeld apply because of that work, for sure. He'd already he had, I believe he had a double major at Heron School of Art in undergrad, and he had photography. Um, and actually, at Cranbrook, the photo department was the first to start looking at post structuralism. And I remember Roland Barth's name came up, and they had some really um, important visiting lecturers.
This sort of blew up not just at Cranbrook, but in design at large. And I mean,
Yes,
this then started, these the legibility war, like all of this stuff sort of
that's
comes out
right.
of these
That's
theory
right.
readings.
Yeah, and also, w- keep in mind that industrial design and Mike and a couple of his colleagues around the country were looking at semantics,
Right.
especially
Right.
out of semiotics in product design. So that was kind of also feeding into this. The challenge was to translate these ideas about meaning and
Right.
communications, sender receiver, how people construct meaning. What does that mean for graphic design? How does it find its way into form? And I think Jeff Keaty said, I kept asking in crits, what does this look like?
Right. Right.
and and it did begin to affect form, and one thing I always kind of, it's a sort of a way to characterize this, is that in the previous stage, the postmodern new wave, students started working with layers of form,
Yes.
very complex form. One of the results of these ideas in communications theory was then the students began to work with layers of meaning. And so, the layers of form, carried content. And became a way of communicating layers of meaning, some of which was personal and some of which was directed towards function and
Right.
communicating the message.
I remember in the 90s, Rick Poynter interviewed you about the work at Cranbrook, and you said something similar. And that basically you were sort of like complaining that everyone thinks of Cranbrook as work as aesthetically loud and busy and layered. And you're like, I'm actually interested in the complexity of meaning. I don't care that much about the layers of form.
Mhm, mhm. I do love the layers of
Right,
form
right,
at times, and I have to say, I do love form, and I love fine typography, and I'm not ready to, give any of that up, but I wanna have it all. It can all be there. This is not an either/or thing, and every piece is
right.
different and has different proportions of these elements.
Right. And I think the realizing that this isn't either or is what made you as co-leading that department able to actually sort of question these things. Like that's the generous perspective here, is not thinking about it as either or. What do you think happened to those conversations? That they were really busy for a second. Everybody was really interested in these,
Yeah.
and they sort of died down. And as somebody who was not part of those conversations, was too young for those conversations,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
whenever I go back and read things that were written at that time, I still find so much relevance to the way design is talked about today, but it seems like that sort of intensity is gone. Do you have thoughts on why that is?
Well, I think it got absorbed,
Mm,
into our process.
mm,
It's there, but we're not in the exploration stage anymore, where there's the
ah,
excitement of discovery. It's part of our methodology now, even if it's not often articulated in a really formal way. But you can. Well, first of all, the NASID standards.
right.
It's incorporated into undergraduate curricular standards, and even less um, theoretical or sophisticated graphic design faculty, I think, are integrating some of these ideas, semiotics and post-structuralism, especially into their teaching. Maybe they're not even aware of it, but it's part of the culture now.
I don't know if you heard me tell Mike this. I reached out to a bunch of your former students
Yeah,
to ask them what questions they want to hear you talk
that's
about,
kind of
and this
sneaky.
relates to something that Mr. Keedy asked, and then Martin Vanesky asked a very similar question. Um, Keedy basically says when you started designing, it was kind of commercial artists that then grew into graphic design and branched into cultural and social practice to a point that design thinking has become cliche. Did you imagine that design would become so ubiquitous? And then Martin asked a similar question about sort of your perspective on how design has changed since then, like sort of the evolution of design. What do you what's your perspective on that?
Well, it definitely design and design thinking have certainly been um, kind of become a buzzword, become seen as some sort of like a desirable value, and at the same time devalued in its kind of um,
Right.
overuse or naive use in times. But I think that design has matured a lot. I mean, certainly since I started, as a designer, and we moved through the '70s. Design really did mature a lot in the '70s and '80s. Industrial designers, especially, used to just always lament, we need, you know, to have business understand the value of design. Our
Right.
clients have to understand. I think we've kind of gotten past that point. Now
Yes, I
people
agree.
pretty much understand you have to have it. And of course, and then there are these two sort of, in a way, opposing directions that have happened. On one hand, everyone's a designer. All you need is the software, right?
Right.
Um, and every everybody has their favorite font, and
Mhm.
that kind of thing. Um, but on the other hand, design process and the technology has become incredibly more complex.
Right.
And, so it takes a higher level of design practice to solve, to complete a project. And in many cases, we have sound and motion and interactivity added to it. The media possibilities are constantly expanding. So research and theory is much more crucial these days to completing a project successfully. So on one
Right.
hand, it takes more expertise. On one hand, we have also, it takes less expertise, and all you need is software.
Andrew Blauvelt had a very good question that I don't know how to work into the flow of this conversation, so I'm just going to ask it to you now. He says, a lesser known Cranbrook story is the connections to the Netherlands in the 1980s. This connection
Mhm.
was the first contact with contemporary Dutch design in the United States that affected both graphic and product design. And he was curious to hear you talk more about those connections and the influence of sort of Dutch design and the Netherlands.
Well, we started going to the Netherlands. Let's see. Well, we had a sabbatical there in 82, 83. I think about 1980, we had our first trip there because Mike mentioned a client and big supporter of the design program was the vice president of design at Herman Miller, Bob
Right.
Blake. And at that point, he had left Herman Miller and became the equivalent of the vice president of design for Philips, which at that point was
Mm-hmm.
a huge electronics company based in the Netherlands. And so when we had a sabbatical, he offered us a design residency in their huge corporate design studios. And with no obligation to do anything for Phillips, just to be there as, catalysts, give some presentations, some critiques, but we were free to come and go. And so I, you know, the first trip to Holland, I realized, wow, there is some amazing graphic design going on here that is somewhat related to what we're doing in
Uh,
the late 70s, circa 1980, new wave, postmodernism, but it's different. And so I took that time while we spent a winter in Holland to zoom around this little country. You can go from city to city in half an hour and visit every interesting designer, and there were many. See their work, collect their work, um, and try to understand where this was coming from. And the thing that was so amazing is that they had some of the older designers knew, the original modernists in the early
right.
20th century in Holland, P.H. Svart, that
Right.
they were, some of them lived to ripe old ages and were still going to professional meetings and having debates, and so there was a direct what we looked at and thought of as postmodern work in Holland actually had a direct lineage back to their roots in the early 20th century, and it was very Dutch.
Right.
It was very authentically Dutch,
Right.
um, and reflected their convictions, and also modern art was very vital in Holland all through these years. So, and a lot of the graphic design was closely related to modern art practice also. So, whereas in the U.S., you know, I don't know. Sometimes it seemed like we were just kind of ODing on this, formal banquet of form, um, or buffet of form. The Dutch seemed to be more grounded, and their practice
Uh,
was coming more out of a cultural tradition. So I wrote an article for ID Magazine on Dutch graphic design.
right.
And I I actually still in my storeroom have an amazing collection of
Uh,
Dutch graphic design. Means they were very generous. Every one of them, when I visit, would pull out all these
yeah, that's
amazing
great.
posters, and I'd go home with them. And we had a traveling exhibition. Our AIGA chapter, I think it went to, I don't know, more than 10 AIGA chapters around the country of Dutch graphic design. And so it was, I think they just served as a useful role model for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. I remember I had forgotten about that ID piece, which I had found a long time ago. And then I always think of Michael Rock wrote that article in the 90s, also called Mad Dutch Disease, where he talks to you in it, I think, about some of that. But that's really the only sort of widely available information about sort of your connection to that. So it was nice to hear that story a little bit. I'm interested in what you're thinking about now. What's we started this conversation talking about how design, you sort of feel like you're not sure what it is anymore, kind of what's going on. What's on your mind, or what's interesting to you right now?
Well, the kind of ironic thing is after years of breaking all these rules of modernism and information design, since 2003, when we completed our time at IIT and became full-time residents of Colorado, I've kind of fallen, into an accidental uh, specialization of information design. Um,
Do you know how many like Cranbrook fans are listening to this and just feel so heartbroken now all of a sudden?
yeah, it's so it's about being in this place. So
Yeah.
I've been designing trail maps. For the Forest
Wow.
Service and the Bureau of Land Management, our public lands, 80% of our county in the center of Colorado is public land. Um,
Okay.
and, um, and we have amazing trail systems. We have more 14,000-foot mountains than any other county in the
Hmm.
country, which are all public. And so I've been designing, kiosks, trailhead kiosks, trail maps, and also some historical material about our area. Just being in the place, sort of resulted in this. And I love the land, and so it's sort of natural to
Yeah.
want to, interpret it in a graphic form, I guess.
It really does come full circle. I mean, the trail map seems like a very Unimark project. Massimo would be proud.
You're right. It's all about clarity, because many people are cartographically challenged. They
Hmm.
have trouble reading maps, and so it's using all those graphic methods to make them as clear and compelling as possible.
I love that. I think that's a great way to wrap up. So I'm going to ask you the last question that I use to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now. Especially, you mentioned you've always been a reader and loved books. What's on your reading list right now?
Well, mostly I'm reading design history. I could mention a couple of books that I really
Yeah.
particularly appreciate recently. One is Roger Remington's book on Will Burton's
Hmm.
scientific approach to information design, which I think is a really beautiful book. And then David Shields, one of our
Ooh.
graduates at Virginia Commonwealth University, just has a new book out on Rob Roy Kelly's American Wood Type Collection. And so,
Kathy, thank you so much for doing this. I mentioned this to Mike also. I am a longtime fan. I've talked to so many of your former students and just see your influence sort of all over the design field today. And so to sort of hear some of the background and hear what you're thinking about now was really a treat for me. Thank you so much for doing this.
my pleasure. Good questions.
This episode was recorded on December 14th, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.